Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a huge clash between the president and the courts over the power to control trade. It's a really big story about executive orders, national emergencies, and a legal challenge that could seriously reshape U.S. economic policy.
And let's just jump right in with the bombshell that set this whole thing in motion. This one line from a federal court ruling directly attacks the very foundation of a massive economic strategy, and it raises huge questions about the limits of presidential power. And this was the outcome. A court decision that brought a sudden, screeching halt to some very steep import tariffs that were hitting countries all over the world. Now, this wasn't just some small legal bump in the road. This was a complete takedown of a key White House policy, and it created this major showdown over who really gets to pull the levers of trade.
Okay, so let's break down what actually went down here. A special three-judge panel at the U.S. Court of International Trade issued a permanent injunction, basically a permanent stop to these tariffs. And their reasoning? It was super sharp, super to the point. The president had just gone too far. He had exceeded the authority that Congress had granted him by law.
Now, to really get why the court made this call, we've got to rewind a little bit and look at how these tariffs were even created. You see, this wasn't your typical bill going through Congress. Nope. This was a strategy that was all about using emergency powers to sidestep the legislative branch entirely.
The whole strategy hinges on this one law from back in 1977, the IEEPA. You can think of it like an emergency toolkit for the president. It's designed to give the executive branch the power to act fast and decisively during a real crisis, letting them regulate international trade when the country is facing some kind of extraordinary threat.
So here's how they used it. It was a pretty clear three-step playbook. First, declare a national emergency. The reason given was persistent trade deficits, which were framed as this extraordinary threat to our economy and our security. That declaration was basically the key that unlocked the power to then go to step 2, bypass Congress. And from there, step 3 was to just issue executive orders imposing the tariffs directly.
And things escalated fast. In early April, in the middle of these ongoing trade disputes, the administration rolled out a new tariff rate on goods coming from the People's Republic of China, and it was set at a steep 84%. But believe it or not, it didn't stop there, not even close. Just days later, after China said it was going to retaliate, the White House hit back with another executive order, and this one cranked that tariff rate on Chinese goods all the way up to an incredible 125%.
This is where it gets really fascinating, because you see this kind of two-pronged approach happening. On one track, you've got this hard-line, escalating tariff war with China. But on the other track, for more than 75 other countries that came to the U.S. to negotiate, a much lower 10% tariff was put in place, and only for a temporary 90-day window.
So all of this, especially that really aggressive stance towards China, was pretty much guaranteed to end up in court. And it set the stage for this epic legal showdown that gets right to the heart of a president's power. So let's look at the two big opposing arguments here.
All right, so here's the core of the fight. On one side, you have the administration arguing, look, this is a national emergency. These historic trade deficits have wiped out communities and they're weakening our national defense. The president has to act. But the court, they came back and said, not so fast. They focused purely on the law, and they ruled that the IEEPA, the very law being used to justify this, simply doesn't give the president the authority to create universal tariffs like these. They also pointed out that there wasn't a clear connection between the tariffs and some of the other threats that were mentioned, like drug trafficking.
And the White House response? It was immediate, and it was pointed. A spokesperson basically framed the whole thing as judicial overreach, saying it's not the place of unelected judges to second-guess how the president handles a national emergency or economic security.
But on the flip side, you had the folks who brought the lawsuit, and that included several states and U.S. businesses. They saw this as a massive win. The Oregon Attorney General, for example, called the tariffs not just unlawful, but reckless and economically devastating. For them, the court's decision was a necessary check on power that protected American families and businesses.
Okay, so the ruling drops. What happens next? Let's get into the immediate fallout because the reactions to this news were fast and they came from everywhere.
Well, the first reaction came from the economy, and it was loud and clear. The moment the news broke that the tariffs were struck down, Dow futures shot up 500 points. That's a huge jump, and it was a clear signal of relief from the markets, which, really hate the uncertainty that comes with trade wars. And this slide really shows you all the different angles, right? The administration immediately says we're appealing this. We're going to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the plaintiffs are celebrating a victory for the rule of law. Trade experts are looking at this and calling it a significant setback for the White House's big agenda. And maybe most important of all, the court made it clear that its ruling was unlawful as to all, meaning this wasn't just a narrow win for the specific people who sued, it applied to everybody.
But here's the thing you have to remember. This is not over. Not by a long shot. Even though that federal court ruling was a big deal, the fight over these tariffs and the presidential power behind them is far from finished.
I mean, the ink was barely dry on the ruling when the government filed an appeal. So the next chapter in this legal drama is already being written. The case now goes up the ladder to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And from there's a real possibility that the Supreme Court could decide to take the case and have the final word on this whole thing.
And really, this whole case, this whole battle, it boils down to one huge fundamental question about how our government works. Who's in charge of trade policy? Is it the president using emergency powers to act fast, or is it fundamentally the job of Congress? This case puts that question front and center, and whatever the final answer is, it's going to have major consequences for a long, long time.